Well, have you ever known someone who thought they were God's gift to mankind? You know, like they are the greatest, they are the most important. Well, let me tell you a story about the smartest teenager in the world. So one time there was this guy, a kid, who won an award for being the smartest teenager in the world. And he happened to be on a plane with a group of 3 other people. It was a small plane. It was the pilot, a pastor, and two teenagers, one of them being the smartest teenager in the world. Well, as they were flying along, the pilot stopped and he turned around. He didn't stop. The plane was flying. But he turned around and he said to the passengers, he says, well, I have some bad news and some worse news. The bad news is we're out of gas and the plane's going down. The worst news is I only have 3 parachutes. He continued on and said, well, you know what? I have a wife and kids. I have lots of responsibilities. I need one of them. He grabbed the parachute and jumped out of the plane. Well, then the other 3 are sitting there in the plane. The smartest teenager in the world says, you know what? I just won the award for being the smartest teenager in the world. I'm important. I may come up with the cure for cancer or something. I really need one of those parachutes. Grabs a bag and jumps out the window, or out the plane. The pastor says, you know what? I'm at peace with God. I know where I'll go. I'm okay. You take the other parachute. The teenager says, don't worry about it. The smartest teenager in the world just jumped out of the plane with my backpack. I love that story. Anyway, but sometimes our estimation of ourselves might need a little adjusting. Who really is the greatest? Who really should be at the center of attention? Who really is deserving of highest praise? Our passage today answers those questions. In Colossians 1, 15 through 20, it proclaims the supremacy of Jesus. He is the greatest, and life, all of life, it's all about Him. And we're going to see this in 3 ways. First, we will see that Jesus is the master of all creation. Jesus is the Lord of the church. And then thirdly, Jesus is in His rightful place above all things. So we begin here in verse 15 with Jesus is the master of all creation. But I want to go back a couple verses and read the last 2 verses that we looked at last week. So starting in verse 13, he says, He has delivered us, speaking of God, has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of His beloved Son, speaking of Jesus, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. And so in those verses is telling us that Jesus redeemed us, that He paid the price of our sin so that we could be forgiven and saved and be given eternal life. Jesus paid the price. He redeemed us. And now we belong to Him. Now we belong to His kingdom. And then Paul continues to talk about Jesus, that one who redeemed us. And so that's where we pick it up here in verse 15. But as you look at this, you could read verses 15 to 20, and it could almost seem like oh, and by the way, since we're talking about Jesus, let me tell you a little bit more. But this is actually, these verses that we're looking at today are actually the high point of the book. They are the central idea of the letter to the Colossians. Everything else in this book is tied to these statements, these truths that we will look at today. So we begin in verse 15. The beginning of verse 15 says, He is the image of the invisible God. Now, this word image refers to something that is the likeness of something or the appearance of someone or something. Like it could be a picture that is pressed into the metal of a coin, or it could be a statue that is made to resemble or to look like someone, maybe even exactly like someone. But when it says here that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, it doesn't just mean that Jesus looks like God. In fact, what does God look like? Yeah, I see some of you shaking your heads like, I don't know. That's the right answer. We don't know. You can't really answer that question other than to say, well, he looks like Jesus. But you can't answer that question because God is invisible. He is spirit. And so that's why he says it's the image of the invisible God. He is spirit. So Jesus is God who you can see. All right? So this is saying here that when Jesus is the image of the invisible God, is saying that Jesus is the exact representation of God. He has the same nature and the same character as God. In other words, he is God. So Jesus is the perfect revelation of God. He is God you can see. So when people saw Jesus, when he was here on this earth, when people saw Jesus, they saw God. When people heard Jesus speak, they heard God. In fact, maybe you remember this conversation from John chapter 14, verses 8 and 9. Jesus is talking with the disciples, and Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father. And by Father, he's talking about God here. Show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Listen to Jesus' response. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and still you do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Jesus says, if you've seen me, you have seen God. He is the image of the invisible God. He is God you can see. And he continues on then in verse 15, the second, he says, he is an image of the visible God, the firstborn of all creation. Now, don't be confused by this statement that he is the firstborn of all creation. Don't be confused and think that that means that he is the first part of creation or the first thing created. That is not what he's saying here. But some people have mistakenly taken it that way. Jesus is not even part of creation. So, but to understand this, we first need to understand what the term firstborn means. Firstborn is used here, and it's used again later in verse 18 as well. So what does it mean? Well, the original literal meaning of the term firstborn refers to the firstborn son of a family. And the firstborn was in a position of great honor, but also a position of great responsibility. You see, the firstborn would get a double portion of the family's inheritance, but he was also then responsible to care for the family in the father's absence or after his death. And so it was an honor, but it was also a responsibility to care for the family. But this title or this term firstborn came to be used more as a title and used to refer to someone who was either first in either time or first in position or rank. And so it didn't just talk about birth order, but about position and status. And so when someone was called the firstborn, it would say that he was the highest or in the first place. Let me give you an example of this. You can see this in Psalm 89. In Psalm 89, God is talking about David, King David. And he says this in verse 20, he said, I have found David, my servant, with my holy oil I have anointed him. And then he goes on talking about David, and in verse 27, he says, and I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Now, what do we know about David? He just said, I will make him my firstborn. But what do we know about David? He was the the youngest of 8 sons in his family. He was not the firstborn of the family. But God says, I will make him my firstborn. In other words, I will appoint him the firstborn. And by that, he explains it that he will be the greatest of kings. And so we see this, that firstborn talks about status, position, that you were in first place. So when Jesus is called the firstborn of all creation or over all creation, it is saying that he is first in both time and rank or position. He's first in time, not that he was first created, but that he existed before creation. And we know that because even here in verse 17, the beginning of verse 17, it says, and he is before all things, and all things hold together. But he says he is before all things. So he existed before everything else was created. Now, how did he exist before? Well, the answer to that comes from the fact of what we already talked about. He is the image of the invisible God. He is God. And as God, he existed before creation. And so Jesus is first in time. He is before creation. He existed before creation. But he's also first in position. Because look at what he says in verse 16. He says, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. He says, all things were created by him. Now, which things were created by him? All things. All right? That means everything. Okay? And these two words are repeated there to make this point very clear. Everything was created by him. So that includes, he lists them off, that includes things that can be seen and things that you can't see. That would include things that are, because he says visible or invisible. That would include things on earth and in heaven. That includes things that are physical or spiritual. It also includes all authorities, all rulers, all spiritual powers. He created them and he is over them. But if you notice also, it says that they were created by him, but it says they were created through him. And when it says it was created through him, it explains that God the Father is the creator, that he created, but Jesus was his agent. This could be a tricky thing to understand, but you could kind of think of it like this. You could say that Jesus was like the master builder who was carrying out God's work of creation. Okay, so God created through him or by him. In fact, we see these same ideas in John chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, where he says, in the beginning was the Word, speaking of Jesus. So Jesus was there in the beginning. And the Word, Jesus was with God, and the Word was God. And so we saw that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is God. He was there with God. He is God. And he continues on, he was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So anything that is created, anything that exists, came into being through Jesus. So we're saying here that Jesus is the firstborn because as God, he existed before all created things, and he is over them because he made them. But we also saw in these verses that these things were made by him, but they were also made for him. And the point is that the point of everything is Jesus. It was by him, but it was for him. It's all about Jesus. Now, before we move on, I just said it's all about Jesus. But we have a tendency to make it all about me. don't we? We have a tendency to think it's all about me. But as you can see, it's not. Another thing that many people make it all about, or put a whole lot of emphasis on, is angels and other spiritual things, spiritualism. And again, that's not right. Because angels are what? Created. Jesus is above. Jesus is great. They are all just created beings less than Jesus. Now, the angels of God, of course, are great servants of God, but they are less than Jesus, and they are under His ultimate authority. So don't make too much about angels. In fact, in the Bible, whenever angels appeared to people, and people tended to either get scared or drop on their knees as if to bow down or to worship, what would angels say? Stop it. They would say, don't do that. Stand up. We are just servants of God like you. So don't make too much of angels, but instead make much of Jesus. Only Jesus is worthy of our worship and our complete trust. Now, one other thing about Jesus and creation, the end of chapter 17, we'll start at the beginning. He says, and He is before all things. And then we get this phrase, and in Him all things hold together. So we're talking about this creation. As the Creator, Jesus also sustains all of creation. In other words, He holds it together. He makes it continue to work. He keeps it from falling apart. So if we look at our world and our universe and everything, the reason why it doesn't just spiral out of control is because Jesus holds it together. It continues to exist because of Jesus. The laws of nature work because of Jesus, because He holds it together and causes them to work the way God meant for them to work. Now, I want you to think about this. Our world spins and orbits the sun, right? And it has to, or life would stop. If the sun didn't spin, if the world didn't spin and it didn't orbit the sun, life as we know it would come to an end. We would have no days. There would be no seasons. There would be no life. But do you know how fast the world spins? The world spins at about 1,000 miles per hour. You ever driven that fast? No, me neither. But I do know when you drive fast and you go around a corner, what happens? You lean, right? Or maybe slide across the car, depending on how fast you're driving and how sharp you take that curve. But the world is spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. Why do we not fall off? Oh, you guys are going to say, well, that's an easy answer. Why? Gravity. Okay, so you would expect, though, when something's moving this fast, everything's going to fly out. But gravity holds it in, okay? And so what causes gravity? Okay, I'm going to get technical here for a minute. I'm going to tell you things that I don't even understand. According to Einstein, based on Einstein's theory, scientists say that mass has gravity. The greater the mass, in other words, the bigger something is, the more gravity, more gravitational pull it has. And what happens is that mass pulls on space-time. It bends or curves space-time and holds you down. So you got that spinning working, but you also have the pull of this mass that is bending space-time and holding you down. I know I don't get it either. But I still want to ask, so how does that work? And you know the answer? We don't know. Scientists don't know. They can't explain it. It's just based on Einstein's theory that this is what happens. And you know, maybe someday they may come up with an explanation. But I know the answer. It's Jesus. Okay? Why does gravity work? Because Jesus holds it together. He makes the laws of nature work. And just one other thing. If Jesus can hold this world and this universe and all of creation together, He can hold your life together as well. If you belong to Jesus, you are in good hands, capable, strong hands. So Jesus is the master of all creation. And now we see that He is also Lord of the church. Look at verse 18. And He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything He might be preeminent. Now there's 4 statements here about Jesus and the church. The first one is that He is the head of the body. Now first we have to say, what does He mean about the body? Well, the body is the church. He's head of the body, the church. Okay? So the body refers to all believers in Jesus. But what is significant about this picture of a body and a head? Well, elsewhere in Romans and 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the church as a body. He talks about the different members of the church being like members of a body. So in a body you have hands and feet and eyes and nose and ears and the other parts. And he says, so we in the church are like that. You know, we have different gifts and different abilities, and we do different things, and we help, and we all work together. And so he talks about that these many parts being unified as one and being connected to one another, because we are connected to Jesus as our head. And so all believers are related to each other because they're connected to Jesus. So he talks about that in Romans and 1 Corinthians, but here in Colossians, the emphasis is more on the relationship between Jesus as the head and the church, the body. You see, think about your body, or any body for that matter. A body can't function without its head. All right, quite literally. If a body loses its head, the body has no life. It can't function. No head means no life. But also, what does the head do? It leads the body. The head tells the body what to do. As Christians, we get our life from Jesus. Without Jesus, there is no life. So we get our life from Jesus. We're talking about our spiritual life. We're talking about the abundant life that we have in Jesus. We're talking about eternal life. It comes from Jesus. Without Jesus, there is no church. There is no salvation. There is no relationship with God. Without Jesus, there is no spiritual life. And as the head, Jesus is in the lead. He is Lord. He is master. He is in charge. He is in the highest place. Now, of course, what does that mean for us? Well, for one, it means that we are to follow Him. We are to listen to Him. We are to obey Him. Have you ever had your hand or your arm fall asleep? You know, and it's not working properly? You know, it's like, and you might say, you can't move it, you know, and your brain says move, and it doesn't move. Normally, when your brain tells a body part to move, what's it do? It moves. But sometimes I might tell my hand to move and it doesn't move. And I might have to actually pick it up with my other arm and move it. But you know what? When that happens, something's not working correctly. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. Don't be like that hand. Don't be like that arm. Listen to your head. Listen to Jesus and be obedient to Jesus. Jesus is head of the body. So, the second thing in relationship between Jesus and the church, it says that he is the beginning. In other words, he is the source or the originator of the church. This is like what we saw in Hebrews, where it said that he was the author or pioneer and perfecter of the faith, meaning that without Jesus, there is no church. And so he did everything that was necessary in order to save us and brought us together as believers. He is the beginning. So he is the head of the church. He is the beginning. And third, he is the firstborn from the dead. Here we get that word firstborn again. But here it's referring to the fact that he was the first to raise from the dead, never to die again. And being called the firstborn implies that there are others who will follow. So he was the first to raise from the dead, never to die again, and others will follow. And so because Jesus died on the cross and then rose from the dead to live forever, others will also raise to live forever. Those who believe in Jesus will raise to live forever. In fact, Romans 6, verses 8 and 9 say this. Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. Now, he says, if we have died with him, meaning that we have believed in Jesus and trusted in his death on the cross for saving us, we are then identified with his death on the cross, our old sinful nature being crucified with Christ. If we have died with him, then we will also live with him. So just like he was raised, we will be raised to never die again. And he continues on in verse 9. He says, we know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. Jesus conquered death. It has no power over him. And so everyone who believes in Jesus, everyone who is with Jesus, will also have eternal life. In fact, this is the promise of John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not what? Perish. Die. In other words, you will have eternal life. You shall not perish, but have eternal life. You see, as sinners, we deserve death. We deserve judgment because we have disobeyed God and broken his ways. But God sent Jesus to die in our place, to take the punishment that we deserved upon himself so we could be forgiven. And when we believe in Jesus, we are given eternal life because Jesus will live forever. Those of us who are with him will also live forever. So Jesus is the firstborn from the dead, with many to follow, all who believe in him. He is first in time, the first one to rise, never to die again, and he is first in rank. He is over all those who follow. And then the fourth statement here about Jesus' relationship with the church is so that he might be preeminent or first in everything. Now, this is actually the result of the first three statements. He is the head of the church. He is the beginning. He is the firstborn from the dead, so that he might be first or preeminent in everything. And so what he's saying here is as a result of his death and resurrection, Jesus holds the highest rank, the highest position. He is supreme. He is the greatest. Now, this may sound a little strange to you to say that because of these things, he might be first, or he became first. Because we just talked about how he is the first, right? How he is the greatest. He already was first and the greatest. We just saw that. Because as God, he is over every created thing. And that's true. But this here is he's telling us that he also became first through his perfect obedience to the Father. You see, after his death and his resurrection, God exalted him to the highest place. God gave him all authority. And God put him over all things. Jesus is Lord of the church. And next we see Jesus is in his rightful place above all things. Let's read verses 19 to 20. It says, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross." All right, so we're talking here about being reconciled. And so what does that mean? Being reconciled means to bring a relationship back into good standing. So like if you had two good friends who maybe they've been friends for years, but then they have this argument, really big argument, and maybe one really hurt the other one, and their relationship is kind of broken, and they like don't want to talk to each other, and they don't want to be around each other, they don't see, and this may go on for hours or days or weeks or even months. But then eventually one of them makes that move and says, you know what, and apologizes. And the other apologizes, and they start talking, and the relationship is restored. That's reconciliation. The relationship has been brought back into good standing, back to the way it was. The relationship is mended. But you could also talk about reconciliation in reference to like bookkeeping numbers. You know, like so if we have two people and they're both adding up numbers, and we've got to make sure that our numbers match. But I add up numbers and you add up numbers and they're not the same. What do we have to do? We have to go back and figure out why. And so we re-add up the numbers and all that until they match, till they line up, till they are reconciled. So they fit together and everything is right. And so you go through and you fix it, everything adds up, everything lines up, and when everything is right and then good, it is reconciled. And so what he says here is that Jesus' death and resurrection made it possible for everything to be made right and brought into line, back the way it should be. But notice the first statement that this verse starts with. In verse 19, it says, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." Now, that statement is very similar to the beginning of verse 15, that he is the image of the invisible God. But here he says the fullness of God dwells in him. And the fullness has the idea of totality or completeness or everything. And so what this is saying then is that everything that makes God who he is, everything that makes God God, dwells or resides or is in Jesus. In other words, Jesus has the exact same nature and characteristics as God. In other words, he is God. So he's not just God-like, or he's not like just a kind of God, but he's what? He's God. Now, why is that important to reconciliation, though? Well, when we think about reconciliation, sin messed things up in this world. And it broke our relationship with God. And sin had to be dealt with. Sin has to be judged. It's wrong. But that meant that we were destined for judgment because we are all sinners. Separated from God, cut off from God. So what's the answer? Well, the answer is Jesus. But see, here's the thing. Only God could live a sinless life. Only God could live that sinless life and satisfy God's holy standards. But it was man who sinned, not God. So only a man could represent mankind. And so Jesus, as a man who is also fully God, is the only one who could do both. He is the only one who can reconcile, because he is the only one who could live a sinless life and then take the punishment of mankind upon himself. And so it's through Jesus and his death on the cross that we are brought back into a right relationship with God. In fact, the end of verse 20 says, making peace by the blood of his cross. In other words, his sacrifice paid the penalty for our sin. His blood was shed to pay the cost of sin. We deserve death. We deserve judgment. We deserve to be separated from God, but we've been given peace with God through Jesus and through his sacrifice. In fact, Romans 5 tells us that we were, as sinners, we were enemies of God. We were sinners who were opposed to God and his ways. But when we believe in Jesus, our hearts are changed. We are made right with God, and that we have peace with God. In other words, we've been reconciled. But I want you to notice one other thing here in verse 20. It doesn't just say that he was reconciling us to God. What's it say? He says reconciling what? All things. So we're not just talking about believers here. He's actually saying that all things are being brought back into their rightful place. Back to the way God created them to be. And so what he means there, and what that includes, is the fact that Jesus is first in all things. That he is above all things. That's the way it was supposed to be. That's the way it is now. Jesus is above all things. He is the ultimate authority, other than the Father, of course. But the thing is that we and all people, then, we owe Jesus our allegiance and our obedience. All things are under his rule. Now, when you look out at the world and you look at things that are happening and the way people live and the choices people make, you would say, wait a minute, it doesn't look like everything is under Jesus' rule. But we know that Jesus is exalted over all. Not just over some, but over who? All. Over all things. Jesus is at his rightful place, ruling over all things. And all people, everyone and everything must answer to him, must give account to him. So whether people recognize that and submit to his rule now or not, he is over all. And Philippians 2 tells us that one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So one day everyone will recognize who he is, recognize his place above them. And some people will not be happy about that. But they will recognize his rightful place over all things and all people. And at that time, believers, his people, will receive the blessings of Jesus. But even now, Jesus is in his rightful place above all things. When we started this morning, I said that sometimes our estimation of ourselves might need a little adjusting. as followers of Jesus, we understand that I am not the greatest, that you are not the greatest. And I'm not saying that to put you down in any way. But we understand that we are not the greatest. We know this, right? But there's something else I know. I may not be the greatest, but I am close to the one who is. And that is a good place to be. And speaking of being God's gift to mankind, Jesus actually is God's gift to mankind. It is good to know Him, and it is good to be right with Him. There is no better way to live. Jesus is the master of all creation. Jesus is Lord of the church. And Jesus is in His rightful place above all things. He is the greatest. He is deserving of the highest praise. Jesus is Lord of all. And this life is all about Him.